Hello friends, in today's video we'll be talking about the rare conjunction between Saturn and Neptune in the sign of Aries at that critical 0-degree mark. And this transit will be occurring on February 20th of 2026, but we have to remember Saturn is going to be occupying the same sign as Neptune for the next 2 years. So this moment is almost like Neptune and Saturn are going to exchange a message, and then Saturn is going to carry it forth. So the topics that we'll be discussing, this is an ongoing process in our lives. And we have to remember we're having this conjunction in a sign that represents actions, assertion, initiative, as well as our sense of agency and will. And we have to remember this is the first sign of the zodiac. So this is where movement is initiated and where intention comes to seek for its expression. And the way that we do this in life is head-on engagement with life. But when we look at Saturn, Saturn carries very contradictory symbolism to the sign of Aries. While Saturn itself is about limitations, restriction, fear, consequences. And then we have Neptune arriving, which ultimately it represents transcendence. And that means Neptune is about ideals, imagination, dissolution of boundaries, psychological fusion, projection, and it has a tendency towards distortion and illusion. So even between these two planets, realism of Saturn versus fantasies of Neptune. And one of the themes that I'm going to focus on in this video in terms of its theme, when these two planets, Neptune and Saturn, come together, we're going to be dealing with themes related to power in terms of how we imagine power, what it is, how it's feared, how we project it onto other people, how power actually produces effect, and how it can be practiced. And it's poignant to frame this in terms of power, considering the sign that they're sitting in. The sign of Aries has a lot of power, this burst of ignition, energy, activation. So this conjunction is giving us an opportunity to examine the difference between imagined potency in life, perceived potency, and actual embodied agency, which allows us to exert our will and act. But before jumping into the depth of this video and exploring this idea, I just want to let you know that there are plenty of videos coming out about Saturn in the sign of Aries. The one I'm working on right now is about Saturn return for those of you who have Saturn in the sign of Aries, as well as the conjunction of Sun and Rahu in the sign of Pisces. I think that's a very interesting placement to look at. And if you want to catch those videos, please remember to subscribe so YouTube sends you notifications. Now, without further ado, let's just get right into the depth of this video and what this combination is indicating. So let me just briefly go through this field of interaction that we call Aries. So first and foremost, Aries represents the ignition point of existence. It governs our impulse to begin, to assert, and to initiate so we can begin our movement. And in Aries, we want forward movement, direct movement, and that's the way we get to engage with our lives. So it's a field of agency. This is also the sign where our will is constantly being tested through our actions. Are we able to perform certain acts? Do we procrastinate? And in the sign of Aries, the force that it's here is the power that operates on the premise of immediacy again. This is a sign where our effort is meant to produce quick effects and results. And when a planet enters Aries, regardless of their signification, Aries will always hand them a script, saying to them, you must ignite. You must initiate, assert, and get yourself into the mode of action and acting. And in the sign of Aries, if it's working at its purest form, action is not theatrical, it's very embodied. Nothing in the sign of Aries is supposed to stay theoretical in the realm of mind and beliefs. You're supposed to act your beliefs. This is a sign that says your impulse must enter reality. So when we come into the sign of Aries, one of the questions that we're constantly getting, do your actions produce effects? If they are, then you're an effective agent in the world. And if you think about it, when we pose that question, the question of power has entered the room. That means, do you have the power to act, to be effective, to be potent? And that's why the conjunction of Saturn and Neptune directs us to this notion of power and why we have to examine it. So even with these two planets where they're signifying imagination, limitation, and fear, our internal states, they can't stay internal in the sign of Aries. They have to be expressed externally and outwardly. They will seek an expression. And we'll see the moment that these internal states seek an external expression, again, we're going to come to talk about power dynamics. And to consider how Neptune and Saturn are going to be playing themselves out, let's just go through each of them very quickly and start with Neptune. As I mentioned earlier, Neptune represents transcendence. If we could just give it one word for all of its symbols, it's going to come to that. Transcend what is. It's about going beyond the temporal and the material world. And that's why it symbolizes ideals. It is that which is about the notion of spirituality, the spirit of the world, the spirit invested within the material. In many ways, Neptune is representing that which is symbolic. It's about the imagination and the formless dimensions of our experience. Another function of Neptune is that it dissolves boundaries. So it dissolves the boundary between fantasy and reality. It can evoke our own personal myth or myths about the world. It generates images where those images can shape our beliefs. And at its best, it inspires devotion and universal compassion. On the negative end of the spectrum, Neptune has some really funky significations. For instance, it operates through projection. It creates psychological fusion, induces illusions. So it comes to be about self-deception. If it's in that part of your chart that is about others, it can be deceptive in terms of other people. It can also be about escapism, cognitive distortion, and the blurring of imagination with actual reality. Neptune can go so far that it can shape our narratives and our ideologies through our identities and the way that we come to understand ourselves. So when Neptune comes into the sign of Aries, this imaginative and idealizing function of Neptune, it attaches itself to our will. And what does that mean in the sign of Aries? What kind of imagery will we get out of it? Well, we get images of strength, images of the self as a hero. The sign of Aries is very individualistic. It's saying something about ourselves as an individual. So the self can become that hero, the savior. The self can come to have a mythology about itself that is larger than life. So we can see, if we start to think about ourselves in that way, how we perceive our agency begins to change. What we're acting towards and why we're doing it will change. And in the sign of Aries, inspiration that comes from it can feel like the reality of our capacity. Our convictions can feel like our authority. And emotional intensity that we feel internally, we can come to believe it's our actual effectiveness in the world. So if you think about it, we're having a perceived kind of personal power, which is actually coming from our imagination. But it might not have a correspondence to the reality of our actual power. And just to explain why this is, we might have a lack of know-how. We don't know how to do something, but we have this perception of, I can do it. I am that person. So it dilutes or distorts our perception in terms of how we really need to position ourselves in the world and in relation to other people to achieve our goals. For instance, what we believe doesn't always have an application in the world. There can be a huge discrepancy between who we actually are and what we believe we are. And because Neptune just entered the sign of Aries, this component is very much untested. So we don't know which part of it is real, which part of it is just part of our own self-fantasy. But that's why we got Saturn here. So let's quickly go through the symbolism of Saturn and see what Saturn's evoking or inducing here. And can I say something here? I feel like I need to explain this because I see it in the comments. I just want to say this from the premise of from where I stand, how I understand these symbols. When I say Saturn does something, I don't mean that gassy planet with the beautiful rings around it up in the sky is reaching down to Earth and making you do something, is making you feel fear. That is not what I mean. They are representation of prototypes and archetypes that are present in the entirety of existence. They are forces of nature. And those forces of nature, those prototypes, archetypes, are embedded within us. So it's saying that it's the timing for that archetype to come to the forefront, which creates similar themes. So when I say Saturn or Neptune or Aries is doing something, I hope we can keep that distinction. I'm using the communicative language of astrology. Because if I was to say in every sentence, Saturn symbolizes this, represents this, signifies this, it creates a sense of detachment where we can't self-reflect to see how these forces are alive within us. When I say Saturn's doing something, in a lot of ways, I'm anthropomorphizing it so that it becomes something personal. I just needed to get that out of the way. But let's get back into Saturn. In general, Saturn signifies restrictions, limitations, objectivity, practicality, being analytical, as well as endurance, realism, distrust, scarcity, slowness, weakness, time, decay. Saturn has so many significations. And most importantly, Saturn represents reality. So it's talking about cause and effect and all the consequences that can come from it. Saturn also symbolizes ordinary, everyday people. People who must operate within tangible, tight bounds and confines of society and life. People that have to constantly confront the constraints of life and the repetition, redundancy, and even boredom that can come from it. And then in other ways, Saturn has a tendency to always expose our inadequacy. And it does this through constant contact with reality. When Saturn comes into the picture, it feels like every time we come to act, reality is just pushing back against us. And we have to remember Saturn in Aries is debilitated. And that's because the signs seek immediacy again and wants to do everything very quick. And Saturn operates through duration of time, long period of time, as well as through imposing a lot of restraints. And that means because Saturn's also debilitated and it can't just do anything that it wants, Aries will constantly initiate, but Saturn's going to stand there and is going to measure that initiation. The Aries within us is going to want to assert, and then Saturn wants to test its legitimacy. So if you think about it, this tension is constantly intensifying the function between impulse and consequences. And just to bring Neptune back for a second, when you put them together, Saturn is here to apply limitation to our imagination that Neptune is creating. So Saturn wants to make our weaknesses in our actions very visible at this time and for the next 2 years. So this combination is trying to show us the gap between inspiration and capability. Saturn's going to make it measurable, and in that way, we're going to come to know it. What Saturn wants to do here in terms of showing things to us is going to do this through immense amount of editing of our action. It's going to slow us down. And Saturn's going to create repetition to test those Neptunian imaginings. It wants to see what it can actually endure. So this conjunction at this initial point, at that 0 degree mark, has a lot to do with exposure. It's about us coming into a head-on collision with our perceived competency. It's going to show us that we have a perception of this kind of power that we have, but in reality, we don't. And I say this because Neptune can create super compelling narratives. I mean, look at what it did in the sign of Pisces. There were some of the most outlandish ways of thinking about the world, spiritualizing the world, that had zero application in the actual real world. And in the sign of Aries, this narrative has very much to do with ourselves now, our personal individual identity. So we're not trying to spiritualize the world anymore. We're trying to spiritualize the self and create this mythology about it with Neptune here. And in the sign of Aries, it can also relate itself to our personal strength, the potency that we have in life to lead ourselves or to lead others. The way we are endowed with this power that we can initiate change just like this, let it spread through us in the entire world, and all of it with a moral certainty, which makes a very dangerous situation when you think about it. But thank God we have Saturn here with its objectivity and with its sense of realism. And not to mention that it constantly creates consequences. Saturn wants to show us where a lot of this is just an illusion and a delusion. And one way, for example, that Saturn is going to expose us to reality. It's going to show us so much of what we're doing is just inflated ideas. That's because we get surges of motivation and determination because we're having these imagination. But we don't have the stamina to back it up or to actually enact it in the world. Or we'll see that we have these deep desires that we just want to express it and we want to consume the world through it. And yet we don't have the skills for it. We come short. Saturn's going to show us that conviction doesn't equate to competence. It's going to want us to see that identification with a cause doesn't automatically generate the ability to act it out. We'll see that we're actually not as able as we thought in creating meaningful change. And one of the most probably brutal things that Saturn's going to bring to the forefront is to let us see that our conception of our self-authority over ourselves and over other people is not real. It's actually resting on our imagination, that it's a mere projection rather than our cultivated capacity. And the way Saturn's exposing things here is through realism. It's bringing realism into the domain of our will. It's showing us our incompetency, impotency, where we're actually under the impression that we're very effective. And it also wants us to understand what it means to have a measured output. Like the input and the output have to measure up. And the way it's going to show us this is by showing us our inconsistencies. It will challenge where we have overestimation of ourselves, because that's what Neptune can do with the imagination. I am a savior. I am the equivalent of Jesus Christ. I can save the world because of who I am. Listen to me. Look at me because of who I am. Saturn's coming in and it's going to be like, really? Put your money where your mouth is. I'm going to test it. If you can do it, fine. Like, for example, it's going to show us our follow through and how it falls apart under severe pressure, or maybe even under very little pressure. What this is doing is dissolving our conception, our imagination of the kind of power that we have, our fantasies about power. Saturn wants us to see where this power is just imagined, where it's actually not something that we're embodying and we can enact it from the core of us. So Neptune's distortion is becoming visible through Saturn's restraint and restricted ways. Saturn wants us to see the actual void where power should be. Not that Saturn wants to take power away from us, but the way that we're supposed to be the possessor of our own personal power. Saturn wants to show us where there's actually a void there. There's a hole there. That's why you're making up these fantasies. For instance, Saturn is going to show us how we project our power onto other people. And it'll make us see why we do this, why we contract our own power to other people. We empower them to enact on our behalf. Why do we do that? And the answer to that usually is that we are over-dependent on other people. We don't understand our own agency in the world, how potent we actually are. So not only Saturn's trying to bring certain people down to earth because they have this inflated self-view, some people see themselves much smaller than they actually are, and Saturn's going to test that also. This is a way for our psyche to start understanding the gap between belief and practiced agency. But of course, this story is not going to end with exposure. As I said earlier, Saturn's going to be lingering in the sign for 2 years. So they're both having an influence on the sign. And even when they're far apart from each other, they're still operating with the same script, which is Aries. So we have to go beyond exposure. And I could do this in another video, but I like to do it now so we have the narrative. So when upcoming transits come, there's always this video as a reference as to why that thing is happening. And that is this conjunction, the presence of Neptune and Saturn in Aries. They're trying to restructure something completely. So I want to go from what they're exposing to why they're doing it so that we understand what they're restructuring. So to go back to our primary point here, this combination is trying to show us how to get rid of our fantasies about our power, about power in general. It could be power in society too. Look at where this sign of Aries is sitting in your chart. But no matter where the sign of Aries is sitting in your chart, I want us to think about this from the get-go. If our imagined potency dissolves, we'll have to confront a choice. And I'm actually posing this as a choice because this happens all the time, even though we don't like to admit to it. When the potency of our action dissolves, the choice is this. Do we continue to rely on projection and fantasy and basically remain impotent in our lives? Or do we actually roll up our sleeve and begin doing the hard work of gaining self-discipline to cultivate our agency? And this could be a subconscious choice, and it is a lot of times for a lot of people. They'll resort back to their imagination rather than being like, all right, I'm going to shatter this imagining and I'm going to engage with real life. And I want you to know this when it comes to Saturn. Saturn favors patience, hard work, and cultivation. And that's because cultivation is about endurance. And Saturn is about that. And to cultivate something, there's constant active repetition. Like let's say you're growing a tree, you're cultivating that. What do you have to do? You're constantly attending to it, doing the same thing every day. Water it. Make sure the soil, there's enough oxygen getting to the roots. Move it towards the light. Repeat. But in general, we're talking about sustained effort over time. These are all Saturnian functions. And when we bring that into the sign of Aries, we're going to be talking about cultivation of our actions. The focus becomes about our actions. And with Saturn here, it's asking for personal responsibility. Like to show up every day is a kind of a responsibility. And it's through action and responsibility of those actions, the repetition, where we can produce potent effects. I mean, in the sign of Aries, if we can diminish our projections and our delusional ways of thinking, our sense of ownership increases. And what I mean by that, we get a higher expression of our personal power. And you know what? There are people who are listening to this right now. Some of you might have a certain relationship, even with the word power. Some people will feel this as something that I want. Others want to exert it on other people. Other people will see it as something dirty. All of these are worth examining. And this is Saturn's job here too right now. But coming back to Saturn, it really wants to show us what it means for a capacity to produce an impact. And just to branch to another effect of Saturn here, it can transform our fear of assertion, even though Saturn represents fear. And that's because Saturn's going to teach us what it means to have measured engagement. And that means we'll know how to meet the challenges of our lives without exhausting ourselves either. I was talking about that extensively about Saturn just in the sign of Aries, which is about economy of efforts. That's what we need to learn. And a lot of times, because we know from our past experiences that we'll get burnt out with something, we won't assert ourselves. We'll put ourselves in a state of inertia, which is like the worst thing to do in the sign of Aries. But Saturn's conditioning us through all the stuff, all the hardship, all the repetition that is bringing. It's conditioning our strength. And relative to Neptune, this constant resistance that we're feeling through Saturn is replacing Neptune's inspiration that doesn't have an actual application in the world. So in a lot of ways, we're learning what it means to have self-trust in the ways that we act. And that's what I mean about transforming our fear when it comes to self-assertion, asserting and enacting ourselves. And I do want to point something out here. I feel like the way that I've talked about Neptune, like Neptune can't do any good in the sign of Aries, but it can have a higher expression. And that could include a sense of devotion to an aspiration. And when that is healthy, that becomes a kind of a ground where we call it our purpose. It's an imagined destination, yes, but you have to have a destination to know where you're going. You know, when you're taking motorcycle lessons, one of the first lessons that they'll give you is that where you look is where you go. So don't go into the turn looking just in front of you. Look past the turn so that you'll make it. So Neptune is giving us that vision, that foresight, that distance away that's not real yet, but it's directing our actions, but only when it's functional. Because then we're drawing on Saturn to understand what the daily work is, the grimy part of it. How do we show up? How do we take on the responsibilities for it? When Neptune becomes functional in Aries, ideals become directional rather than being something intoxicating that we get lost in it. And then we want to sell that same snake oil to other people to buy our stories too. Come and join my fantasy. Like when it's healthy, our beliefs can actually inform our effort. It becomes our standard, our higher standard. Like our imagination can inspire and fuel our perseverance. And we have to be relentless with Saturn in Aries. So Neptune here can add to our strength if we can see that we got to prevent this guy from masking our weaknesses. So when we think about the long work that's ahead of us, which is about restructuring our will and our agency, it's all going to be about how do we shift our emphasis from our imagined influence to demonstrable capabilities, capacities, and real life applications. And again, the beauty of this signature is that it's going to take time. We have 2 years to work with this. So we have an opportunity to go from perceived power, agency, and will to how do we actually employ it in our lives. We have time to be trained, to train ourselves. And in the next section, I actually want to talk about this training ground, which we will have in front of us for the next couple of years. And let's think about what training is for. At the most basic level is a set of procedures to induce development. To want to train for something is to presume that strength, know-how emerges through repetitive conditioning. And as I've already mentioned, Saturn in Aries requires sustained practice of our self-assertion, while Neptune here can actually help us refine our vision of what we're training for. Like in very practical ways, one way to understand this training ground that we're in, we'll come to constantly negotiate with and wrestle with the ways that we falter. Like we set a goal, we say, I'm going to do it this way. I'm not going to do this today. And then by 5 p.m., we have already dropped the ball. We'll see where our follow through diminishes on a whim. Like something comes up and it'll hijack your attention, your energy, and you just can't go through with it. Or where fear comes in and it interrupts our engagements. We're training to get rid of all these stuff because we're trying to understand what our power is, what our will can do, how we are an active participant, an active agent in the world. So in a lot of ways, we're being trained to be able to sustain our energy and our effort beyond that initial surge of motivation. I'm determined, I'm inspired. And then 2 hours later, it's as if it never happened. And all of this, of course, always involves overcoming our discomfort, the ability to be a little stoic, to give up our comfort. That's the way to cultivate any skill. Like someone who's learning how to play guitar, it hurts at the beginning. The tip of your fingers, you're building calluses, but you have to endure that. And think about it. You come in day one, you can only play for 5 minutes. And then by month one, you can sit and play for 45 minutes, or practice, better to say. And if you think about it, we're getting to see our own power. It's becoming measurable, which is essentially our capacity to initiate and to sustain that effort over time. We're actually producing measurable effects and results. And to be able to show up, we're going to have to pay attention to details of life, not to have detours middle of the day. Like we'll see that we can't show up just because we feel enthusiastic that day. If we really want to be good at this, we have to show up no matter how we feel, what we think, what happens. So we can't rely on the fantasies to do the actual work. Yes, Neptune's giving us the image of I want to be a guitar player who can do this or that. But the work of it belongs to Saturn. We're learning discipline. Power has a lot to do with discipline. Like know how to conduct yourself at a certain moment in life, be disciplined enough not to have a reaction, to maintain your position. Sometimes it's as basic as that, but an undisciplined person cannot do that. This is what Saturn's bringing to the table. We're learning timing and restraint. And if you think about all of this, once when we start to master it, all of this equates to being precise, having precision. Talk about the kind of confidence you suddenly have when you are at that place. And not to mention, Saturn's allowing us to understand what it means to be responsible for our vision, that thing that's coming from Neptune. Our visions can consume the rest of our lives in a very tragic way if we don't know how to enact and direct ourselves to it. Another thing that Saturn's doing is making us very comfortable with encountering our limitations. And we have to become comfortable with this because this is where a lot of people will divert their attention to their fantasies. They don't want to confront their limits. They don't want to confront other people's limits because understanding limits right away, it puts you in a position where you have to take responsibility for things. Another thing about Saturn and another thing and another thing. But it is teaching us how to endure boredom. And a lot of the boredom is coming from doing the same thing day in and day out. And that's a lot of times that's enough to lose sight of that bigger vision. It's like the vision is so grand, it's so exciting, but the actual steps to it are redundantly painful, blunted. But Saturn's teaching us how to work with it. And if we know how to move through this is how we get gradually better. So when we think about this training ground is maturing our sense of agency and our power. Saturn is what's going to stabilize our will. This training is going to stabilize it. Our identity comes to be less about what we like to project of ourselves as that fantasy that we have, our imagined potency, to be more an enactment of our actual power and potency. So the meaning of power shifts here. It goes from emotional intensity to discipline effectiveness. And if you think about it, this is the way to make our dreams come true. If you have a dream or a vision about anything, we have to go through these procedures and steps. We have to cultivate our inner strength, our endurance, our tolerance for discomfort. So this transit right now with both Saturn and Neptune in Aries is about consolidation of power. It's about understanding the very nature of power, personally and socially. Personally, in the way that power is inherently within us. How we misuse it, underuse it, overuse it. We're going to get to see all of these dynamics. And this consolidation component of the transit has an existential dimension, which is about how power is present, is always participating in real time and in reality. So I want to actually talk about this for a second, what it means to have this very present now participation in reality when it comes to the concept of power. And I want us to start here. To exist, if you think about it, in even most basic levels, is to exert some sort of an influence. And that could be from what you eat to when you go to sleep, the most basic. I'm not even talking about the bells and whistles. And every action that we do perform alters the condition of our existence and those around us. And Aries embodies this participation through initiation, while Saturn, when in the sign of Aries, is insisting that this participation has to be about constraints and duration of it. And Neptune here, when we talk about that participation again, is about what is the meaning of it. So why the hell am I participating at all? What's the vision here? So when we get these three factors emerging, we're supposed to learn. Affect emerges through alignment. That means there has to be an alignment between vision, intention, structured and sustained effort. We're getting to see if our notion of power, agency, and will is about projection or through projection, it's dissipating our energy. We have to really understand what it means to have ownership of our own power, to be a participant in reality. And right now, and for the next 2 years, we're being asked a set of questions. Like if you were to take the feelings and the modes of the day and formulate them into questions, they would sound something like this. Like, what real effects do your actions produce in the world? Where does your initiative generate real, tangible outcomes? Where does it dissipate? Where is your will enduring and where does it falter? In what instances do your beliefs actually support your actions? And where is it that your beliefs are actually replacing your actions and you're becoming inactive? And if you think about it, a lot of these questions are coming from Saturn, and they're all questions of measure. And that's because Saturn knows it's through measurement that we refine things. We make things more concise, hence more effective. We can do more with less. Saturn's showing us what it means to have practice and application, and it's practice that creates potency. As you can see, we're not just being shown the nature of power, but what it means to possess it and to execute it in a real way, and why it's so necessary. So this conjunction at its best is about integration. It's about knowing how to go from an ideological identity to mature selfhood where we're self-possessed, to go from contracting out our power to other people to possessing our own personal power and being the sole owner of it. And when I say the word power, if it makes you cringe, it is really worth sitting there and thinking about where that comes from, because you are a site of power in the expression, in the composition and the configuration that you are. The fact that you're an animated being with consciousness who can decide and who can affect other people, affect the trajectory of your own life, other people's, and even the history of this planet, it's saying that you have power. And your relationship with power and us understanding this is one of the most important things we can do. To understand the nature of power is super important. And now, before closing, please remember to share, subscribe, and comment, especially comment. I want to know what your relationship with power is. How do you understand that word? How are you looking forward to grappling with this concept, to embody it, to enact it? What is your vision, and how does all these components that was discussed in the video, how are they coming into play in your life? I'd love to know. And we'll continue our Saturn dialogues through the upcoming videos. And for this video, there will be a related article on the website, and the articles always include some self-inventory questions. This one will have 20 of them, so it's good to just sit down and to ponder and to contemplate through these questions to understand your own position and how you negotiate with things. To find the article, you can go to my website at parisayazdi.com. There you can also find the information for how you can get a reading of this transit or of your birth charts, or you can go to the description box below. I have my email there. And now to close. This conjunction in the sign of Aries is inviting each of us to assess where we stand in relation to our willpower, our agency, and our sense of power in general. It's asking us to understand how we understand power, how we employ it, how we practice it, negotiate with it. It's encouraging us to assess our beliefs and how some of our imagination, ideologies, ideals has taken up too much space. Instead of cultivating application, we just resort back to our fantasies. It's asking us to see where fear has restricted our assertion, because our vision might be so big that we don't have real life application. So it just puts us in a state of paralysis. It's asking us to see where our projection of power has obscured our own power and the way that we can be self-possessed. What this is indicating is that we are officially in the training grounds of Saturn and Neptune, and the metrics are becoming very visible. We're participating in the refinement of our individual capacity to initiate, to endure, and to become an effective agent in the world, as well as within the structure of existence itself, because we are an iteration of it. Existence in itself is an expression of power. And if we are its expression, that power is invested within us. And one of our greatest responsibilities in life is to understand what this power is, what its effect is, what it can do. So this is the time for that. And I say this to conclude the video. May we gain clarity about our power, honesty about its limits, and endurance in developing it. May the force be with you. That's it for today. Sending you much love. Till next time.